Now that I'm well into what's shaping up to be a decent tomato season with over 100 pounds harvested so far, I thought it might be useful to document my methods and strategies for bringing in a decent harvest from year to year. This video will cover topics including seed starting, transplanting, pruning, fertilization, dealing with pests and diseases, and even a little bit on processing and preservation. I want to emphasize that while my method works great for me, it's certainly not the be-all and end-all of tomato cultivation strategies. It does involve quite a few extra meticulous steps in the beginning, and that's simply not going to appeal to everyone. There's more than one way to grow a lot of tomatoes, and I encourage everyone to do what works best for them in their own gardens. Also, a quick disclosure. The first two parts of this video are a mashup of my two earlier tomato videos, so please skip ahead if you've already watched those. The first thing I'm going to do is start prepping my soil. While they do make special seed starting mixes that come pre-sanitized and sifted a little finer than the typical potting mix, that tends to be more expensive, which is fine if you're just potting up a few things, but I have a lot to do and that gets expensive in a hurry, so I just grabbed this organic potting soil that was on sale at my local Walmart. Doesn't necessarily have to be organic. I do try to keep, all the various synthetic additives to a minimum when I make my selection. The alternative had some kind of polymer-coated ammonium nitrate in it, and I gave a pass on that stuff, even though it was a little cheaper. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to run the potting soil through a soil sifter. It's just really quarter-inch hardware cloth nailed to a frame. The reason I do this is potting mixes tend to be a bit woody. There's chunks of, larger pieces of broken down peat moss, twigs, sticks, other various chunks of wood that can really interfere with starting small seeds like tomato seeds. So I put in the extra effort here and sift it a little finer than how it comes. Again, this can be avoided by buying a designated seed starting mix, but you will be paying a little more for that. There are a number of recipes where you can make your own seed starting mix, but to be honest, I only have so much DIY work in me. Here, I'm actually going to bake my soil in the oven for an hour or two at about 350 degrees. The reason I do this is to kill off things like fungal spores, and it's important to remember that fungus is what causes damping off, and that's when you one day you're looking at your seedlings and it looks like somebody pinched them all off and they're all dead. Also kill off fungus gnat eggs, which those can be a real irritation. It's important to cover the soil. It's at 350, so it's below the ignition temperature for most woody materials, but just to be on the safe side, I put some kind of cover on my soil when I bake it, just to make sure there's not enough airflow to start a fire. You see here I had to actually turn the lid upside down to get everything in the oven. But yeah, usually an hour or two heats it through sufficiently to kill off any nasties. I prefer to start my tomatoes and other nightshades in large containers like these 32-ounce repurposed food containers here. The reason is I start my stuff early. They get big before I put them out. They're like 10, 11 weeks under grow lights. And if I start in cell packs or smaller pots, I have to repot, and that's aggravating and it causes some shock to the plant. A lot of what I'm doing this year are using these giant 36-ounce drink cups I found online. These are actually specifically made for the classic college game of beer pong. They even came with a handful of these oversized ping pong balls here. I just gave those to my daughter, though not for beer pong because she's 4. You will obviously have to poke holes in the bottom of these. There's a couple ways to go about that. You can get a drill or carefully with a knife or a pair of scissors so you don't split. I just heated up a nail on my grill outside and melted through. I like melting the holes in them because I don't get a lot of plastic dust going everywhere, though you're going to want to do it outside on account of the fumes. But once the drainage holes are poked, you're going to want to sanitize. I especially reuse pots. You're going to find that sanitization is a running theme in my seed starting. I find a quick bath in a mild bleach solution is more than sufficient to kill off any bacteria or fungal spores that might cause problems. Next, going to add some soil to the cups. I fill about 2/3 of the way. This leaves a little extra space. Most nightshades will root out of their stems, and adding soil after they grow promotes a healthier root ball. I'm going to also label each cup before I start watering when the tape might not stick. I do compact the soil down in the cup a bit. I'm not trying to make something like hard packed concrete, but if you just leave it loose and fluffy, when you add your water, it's going to collapse down and might end up without enough soil in the cup. Um, Speaking of watering, I always water before I plant, and you can see why here. When you add your water to dry potting or seed starting mix, it's often very hydrophobic, and a lot of that stuff, a lot of the components are going to float to the surface like you see here, and that can obviously disrupt a freshly planted seed. You're not going to know where it's going to be after watering. So I hydrate everything first, pour in the water, give it a few minutes, let everything soak up and then I go from there. All right, now it's time to prepare my seeds. The tomato seeds I'm planting today are a bush dwarf patio variety cherry tomato that I've had great success with over the last season. And you guessed it, the first thing I'm going to do is actually sanitize my tomato seeds. I'm going to do this with a quick soak in some 3% hydrogen peroxide solution. This is what you'll get off the shelf in any pharmacy or big box store. Nothing special. Sorry about accidentally bumping the tripod there a few times. It's really hard to work around a tripod while doing all this stuff, actually. It doesn't have to go in for too long, maybe a minute or two. When that's up, I'm just going to pour into that strainer there. Makes it easy to separate the seeds from the hydrogen peroxide. I do give these a quick rinse under the faucet, followed by drying off on a towel or paper towel. This is a more important step than you would think. Trying to deal with wet seeds and wet fingers is just going to stick. It's going to be kind of a miserable experience trying to do that with everything sticking to your skin. So patting these nice and dry is really a small helpful step in the process. All right, now it's time to actually plant the seeds. The first thing I'm going to do is take this pencil and poke holes that are 1/4 inch, maybe 1/2 inch deep. And yes, I sanitized the pencil before using it. Next, drop in the seeds, as you see there. And then I'm going to pinch those holes closed and pat them down a little bit. Really nothing too complicated or advanced here. Seed starting 101 is you always put more seeds in a pot than you're going to use. I do 2 or 3. This is going to accommodate any duds that might have occurred in the seed packet. Also, if you do get 2 seeds per pot, you can propagate the cuttings. I'm going to go over that in a later video. Now everything's going to live under grow lights for the next 10 to 11 weeks. I have these set to run for 16 hours, 8 hours off. The long growing day compensates for the fact that my grow lights are not nearly as bright and efficient as natural sunlight, so they need a little extra. If previous years are any indication, this will still be sufficient in the next 10 weeks to get these to a growth of about 10 to 12 inches by the time I transplant in mid-April. That's exactly what I want to kind of get ahead of the heat. My timer is set to run these primarily during the overnight hours when power is a little cheaper. It's very likely that while you're waiting for the seed to germinate, the very top layer, that 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch layer of soil, is going to dry out under the grow lights. This obviously needs to be kept sufficiently moist for the seed to germinate. So if drying occurs, you're going to want to use a spray bottle to re-moisten the soil surface. Pouring in with a watering can, that tends to disrupt everything. It could dislodge the soil deposited on the surface where it's just going to keep drying out. 4 days later, my seedlings have just emerged from the soil. This is when I'm going to cease any form of top watering and switch to bottom watering. And of course, bottom watering is where you add the water to the tray below the cups. Capillary action then pulls water up into the dry parts of the soil. Ideally, you want a dry surface and damp roots. This is going to reduce the chances of damping off, which is caused by a fungus, and fungus loves a damp environment. So to save your seedlings, switch to bottom watering once the plants emerge. So here I have a bottle of copper fungicide. I apply this as a precaution every 1 to 2 weeks to my seedlings. This phase is where the seedlings really are their most vulnerable over the next, maybe 2 to 3 weeks after emerging, and I just don't want to take any chances. To demonstrate how much better tomato and other nightshade seedlings do when you sanitize and take a little extra care, I'm doing 3 pots of tomatoes completely the wrong way. I haven't sanitized anything at all, and I'm doing these in peat pots, which make it tremendously hard to regulate moisture. And I'm going to set these on a sunny windowsill where I know they're not going to get adequate light. I'm actually trying to get these to damp off, so in my next video I can show what damping off looks like. So why do I put in so much extra effort and extra steps in starting my tomatoes? About 3, maybe 4 years ago, one of our first years gardening, we started close to 100 tomato, pepper, eggplant seedlings, and we did them, the traditional method, had them up against a sunny window, south-facing window, and everything started out doing really great. But then the seedlings started to get leggy as they tried to reach that sunlight that was still low on the horizon through a window. We did them in peat pots, and everything, having trouble regulating how damp everything was. And then one day we came home, and it looked like somebody had come in and pinched off every last tomato stem. Did a little research and found that was caused by, that's what's called damping off. It's caused by a fungus, and if your seedlings are leggy, which means they're really tall and skinny and trying to reach the light, they are more susceptible, because the stems are thinner, they're more susceptible to that fungus that causes it. Also, doing things in peat pots, everything stayed and it got moldy and damp, and it was just a complete mess and really discouraging. So since then, I've made a real effort to put in extra steps and do all of that extra sanitization that you just saw, keep everything really nice and clean, and really try to cut down on the fungus. So the big disadvantages to this method, of course, extra cost and extra space. Obtaining, unless you can find, a lot of previously used containers to convert into starter pots. Buying bigger pots costs more money, that's all there is to it. Coming up with all of the soil to fill those big pots also costs extra money. Additionally, it eats up more space. Now, this isn't going to be an issue if you are a sane and reasonable gardener, unlike me, who has to do everything completely overboard. And if you just want to start, maybe half a dozen tomato plants, and like a content, reasonable person, you're happy with that, doing things in bigger pots with more soil and taking up a little extra space under your grow lights, that's not going to be a big deal. When you want to do 50, 60, 70, 100 plants like this, that is a definite, you notice it in terms of budget and time and space. The big advantages that I find with this is, number one, I don't have to water these pots very often. Spray them down, of course, to keep the surfaces moist, but the pots themselves retain water for a week or more. Additionally, I'm not going to have to repot anything as the plants get big over the next 2.5 months. This cuts down on a lot of work, and in years past, every time I've repotted my tomatoes from, say, small 3-inch pots up to something bigger, I've lost a few plants. So it's nice to be one and done in these 32-ounce to 36-ounce containers. So, are all of my extra sanitization steps, the giant containers that cost more, the extra soil, the extra space, the 16-hour days under the grow lights, is this all overkill? Possibly, but my philosophy has always been that overkill is how you win. Now, it's very possible that you can have good, healthy tomato seedlings and consequently tomato plants without doing so much meticulous, tedious work. But I've noticed that since I switched to this method, my seedlings over the last couple of years have really just been strong, healthy, and amazing. So I'm sticking with it. 2 to 3 weeks after the seedlings first emerge, you should be seeing a good number of true leaves. These are the forked leaves that look, well, like tomato leaves, as opposed to the first cotyledons or seed leaves that emerge just after the plant pokes through the soil. It's about here when I am going to start fertilizing, giving these a little bit of food to get them going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a batch of worm castings tea. This stuff is really easy to make. Also, it doesn't stink, which is a huge plus indoors. All we're going to do is mix about 1 cup of worm castings per gallon of non-chlorinated water. Non-chlorinated is key. Some recipes do call for it to go in a bag first. That's just to prevent the particles from blocking up watering cans. Since I'm just going to be dumping this in the bottom of my seed trays, I don't really care, so I'm just dumping it straight in the water. I'm going to give it a little stir and let it sit for a few days. After that, I'm going to pour it into bottom water. Once the plants are in the 5 to 6 inch tall range, which should be at about 4 to 5 weeks after they break the surface, that's when I'm going to go through and I'm going to remove carefully the weaker of the 2 plants in each cup. The process is as simple as you'd imagine. You just go in with a clean pair of scissors, clip one of the seedlings and set it aside, though I don't like to discard them, and you'll see why in a moment. Next, I'm just going to add a little extra plant food in the form of a few tablespoons of worm castings, and also a tablespoon or 2 of a dry, slow-release organic fertilizer. The brand really doesn't matter. There's a number of options, and they're largely all the same. After that, I'm going to take some more potting soil and top off the cup. The idea is that adding a little more soil up the stem will cause roots to grow out of the stem, making for a stronger, healthier root ball. Believe it or not, all is not lost for these poor discarded tomato starts here. Since tomatoes love to sprout roots out of their stems, all I'm going to do, I'm going to take these and pop them in a jar of water and let the roots start to form. This gives me a number of backup plants. What I can do once the roots start to form, I can put them in starter pots of their own, and many of them, they're not all going to make it, but many of them will. These will become perfectly viable tomato plants. So as I take my clippings, I'm going to stick them in these little jars of water that are going to go back under my grow lights, and after a few days they're going to start to sprout rootlets, and at that point I can plant them. Once daytime temperatures are solidly in the 60s Fahrenheit, I begin sun hardening my plants. This is done by either bringing them out for an hour the first day into full sun and then putting them back under grow lights, increasing that maybe in a half hour a day, or you can bring them out on a few cloudy days in a row without having to bring them in after a short period. To be honest, the first day I put these guys out in the sun, I got busy at work with a really crazy day and completely forgot about them, and I lucked out and they turned out to be fine. I'm kind of wondering if it has to do with how big the plants were before I started to bring them out in the sun. No guarantees that a big plant start will be immune to the damaging effects of too much sun at once, but I dodged the bullet here, and these weathered it just fine. Unfortunately, I did run into some problems under the grow lights. This tray of previously beautiful Cherokee purples, it fell victim to, I'm pretty sure, plant edema. This occurs, and it's commonly happens under grow lights when plants are overcrowded. The plant can't aspire moisture as fast as it takes it in, and cell walls rupture and major damage occurs. Judging by the symptoms, I'm pretty sure that's what occurred here. It wasn't fungal because nothing else caught it. Edema can be pretty selective as to which varieties it affects, and it seems like Cherokee purples are just very prone to it. So I made the call just to scrap these. At this point, I still had more than a month to start a new batch of Cherokee Purple. Instead of trying to nurse these ones back to health, I called it and recycled the potting soil and discarded the plants themselves. It's unfortunate that this happens, and never happy to see plants die. But that's why I grow so many, and I have backup plants. I learned that lesson hard early in my experience as a gardener. Always grow more than you think you're going to need. You can always give away extras. So here's one of our tomato cuttings, one of our quote-unquote discarded starts. After about 5 days, you can see the adventitious roots forming out of the stem. So now this one is good to plant. So all we're going to do is carefully place the stem down in a partially filled cup of starter soil and then start backfilling in around it. I want to fill this right up to the first set of leaves just to encourage more roots to sprout out of the stem. Again, you always want a nice, strong, healthy root ball if you can help it. Smaller starter cups are fine for this part. The roots aren't going to have enough time to fill one of the giant cups as it is. This step occurred 2, maybe 3 weeks before I wound up transplanting them into the garden. So a regular old 16-ounce drink cup or similar size starter pot is just fine. And here's a tray full of planted cuttings, for lack of a better term. I don't expect all of these to survive. It is a pretty traumatic process for the plant to be separated from its original set of roots and then forced to sprout a new set of roots out of the stem. So some loss is inevitable, but these are kind of extras anyway. But this year I am keeping these separate and making note of where I planted the cuttings versus the untouched tomatoes. I want to see if there's any loss of production or lower production that occurs with the tomatoes that I grew from rooted cuttings. After rooting the bulk of my cuttings, I began to wonder if maybe the step of putting all of them in jars of water under the grow lights was unnecessary. It's just how I've always done it, and I'd never really questioned it until this moment here when I decided to see if I could get one of the cuttings to root just by sticking it in a pot of damp soil. And yeah, it worked just fine. The cutting did languish for a few days in the pot. I thought it wasn't going to make it, but then it rallied, and as you can see here, it's looking nice and healthy. While I wait for the weather to warm up enough to safely plant out the tomatoes, I'm going to do a little bed prep. In beds like this one where I have a cover crop going, I'm just going to grab a pair of clippers and mince everything up and let it fall down on the bed for a chop and drop. Once everything's cut down, I'm going to cover temporarily with a layer of cardboard. This is to block out light and kill off anything that might be still alive. The layer of chopped vegetation will start to break down, and then it'll act as a layer of mulch and a layer of compost. I'll definitely have to add some supplementary mulch to it. There's no such thing as too much mulch here in the Sacramento Valley, but it should get me going and should actually start feeding the soil as that layer starts to rot down and the worms start to do their magic. A number of my beds, until very recently, had a winter crop going on them, so I didn't have a chance to remove the wood mulch that I've been trying to get away from and amend the soil with compost. So I'm going to simply add a layer of my homegrown compost here, made largely from chicken manure, chicken mulch, and various kitchen scraps and other green material. Because some of the woody matter in there looks like it hasn't fully broken down, instead of blending this into the soil, which for fear of tying up nitrogen, I'm not going to do. I'm going to spread this on the surface of the beds as a combination compost mulch. And as I anticipated, the broken down black gold part of the mix in a recent rainstorm seeped into the soil, leaving rotten wood chips on top. But what is encouraging is there's a lot of soil life going on just under the surface here. It doesn't take much digging or scraping here to find a worm, and that's exactly what I want to see. So feeling pretty confident that I have enough organic matter and nutrients in these beds to get tomato crops going. And it's never too early to start mulching. This year, I am mulching to whatever degree possible with green matter that I am able to gather and cut from my own property. This is the only time of year, early March through maybe mid-May, when free biomass grows. So I'm taking advantage of that to collect some free mulch. I realize that there is a risk of getting some weed seeds in the garden by mulching with random organic crap, but I would much rather have to deal with weeds than contaminated garden beds from herbicide treated hay or straw. So at least I know this, to whatever degree anything can be completely clean in this modern world, this is as close as it gets. 3 to 5 days before I know I'm going to plant out my starts, I like to go through them and clip off all lower branches, maybe the first 2 or 3 branches with a set of sterilized clippers or scissors. This frees up a longer length of stem to bury in the soil, which encourages additional root growth. And removing these a few days ahead of time allows the wounds to start to scab over, so it's not as bad an inroad for potential infection. The last bit of prep work we're going to have to do before actually planting out the tomatoes is get some infrastructure in place. Tomato vines, of course, get big and heavy, as do the fruits, and if you don't have something to tie them off to, they're just going to pull themselves apart. So for my big non-determinate tomatoes, my Cherokee purples and my Virginia sweet, which can get 6, 7 or more feet tall, I'm going to make stakes out of these ultra cheap 1x2 lumber strips from Home Depot. These can work fine. You just have to make sure that there's no big knots going all the way through, or they will snap right in half. The only thing that I'm going to have to do to these is take a circular saw and quickly cut some points onto the ends just to make them stick in the dirt a little bit more. Half-assed rough points are fine. We're not trying to kill vampires, we're just trying to get them to go into the dirt. With the soil being nice and soft from recent winter rains, the stakes push in nice and easy with minimal effort. I'm putting 6 stakes in each of these 2 6x3 foot beds. This might look a little overcrowded, but I'm planning on pruning down all of my indeterminate slicing tomatoes to 1 productive stem apiece, and I'm also going to be removing a lot of the foliage as they grow, so there's going to be plenty of breathing room in between them. It's not going to be much of a problem. When it comes to stakes and support structure for tomatoes, there are a lot of elaborate and often costly solutions out there, and I think those work great for people who are only doing a handful of tomatoes. Buy the super expensive heavy-duty cages for your tomatoes. If you're planting 3 or 4 of them, that's great. I have about 70 tomatoes that I'm planting this year, so I can't afford to do anything more elaborate or expensive than pieces of wood in the ground. In fact, for my smaller determinate varieties, I'm salvaging and scrounging everything I can, from leftover lumber strips from projects past to sticks, and I think I even cut a point on a broken shovel handle to use. This is one place where I have to go ultra cheap if it's going to work at all. As the plant grows, I'm going to take a nice soft piece of ligature and tie the plant to the stake. If a cluster of fruit starts to sag, I'm going to tie that cluster of fruit to the stake. Really simple. It's going to look like a mess of twines and strings come July, but that's fine. Sometimes, you have no choice but to cheap out a little bit when it comes to gardening. All right, with all the stakes in place, I'm in a good position to actually start planting the tomatoes. The first thing I'm going to do is brush aside some of this mulch and make a little space for myself, and start digging. Nothing really too complex or complicated about any of this. It just gets a little tedious and it's a little labor intensive, especially when you have a lot of tomatoes to plant. I like to try to get the tomato at least 12 inches in the ground between the root ball and a length of stem. Uh, I have the I have better success the deeper I go, reasonably. It gets the root ball down a little further away from the surface where it's less likely to dry out, and additional roots will sprout out of the stem as we saw earlier, making for an even stronger root system. Getting the plant out of the cup can be a little tricky. I don't really have a way to convey, a special method for that. It's kind of something that you just have to develop a feel for. It's important, though, to be as gentle as you reasonably can and not try to yank the whole thing out by the stem. That's just a recipe for disaster. With the plant in the ground, it's just time to backfill. And perfect. Now I just have to do that almost 70 more times. Once all the plants are in the ground, it's a good time to place the emitters for your drip irrigation system if you're in a place where using one is a benefit. I put my lines in last year, and these have been sitting unused now for an entire winter. So before I put the mulch layer on, I want to place these, activate the system, and make sure everything is still working, there's no blocked lines, and nothing is leaking. All right, everything is looking good so far. I will be piling a significant amount of mulch over my emitters. That's going to cut down on overspray. I want to be watering my soil and not the surrounding yard. I also, to whatever degree possible, want to keep the spray off of the plants themselves. The idea is I like to have plants with everything under the surface reasonably sufficiently damp, and everything above the surface bone dry. That helps cut down on the chances of fungal ailments such as blight. Prior to mulching, I'm going to go around looking for any instance where I have leaves touching the soil, and I'm going to take a sterilized pair of scissors or clippers and remove said leaves. This is to reduce the chances of soil-borne ailments, fungal or bacterial, from infecting the plant. Leaves in contact with soil is a very common disease vector for tomatoes. Next up, it's time to mulch. As mentioned earlier, this year I'm trying, to whatever degree possible, to mulch with lawn clippings and other green material I harvest around my property. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough to cover all of my beds, so I had to go out and purchase some extra mulch. What I bought were these two alfalfa hay bales from a local Tractor Supply. And the reason I specifically chose alfalfa hay is because I know that the broadleaf herbicides that I'm so concerned about will also kill alfalfa. So it stands to reason that if this alfalfa has been sprayed with anything, it's not going to kill off my tomatoes, peppers, etc., etc. I want to cut in real quick here, as I learned additional information after recording the segment. It turns out alfalfa can host a plant disease called alfalfa mosaic virus, which can infect and kill all manner of other plants, including tomatoes. Now, I lucked out this year, but I'm not sure I'm willing to roll the dice on alfalfa hay in the future, and anybody considering using it should probably factor that into their decision. The beds are now fully mulched, but unfortunately I'm not done. I have to take one final step, and it's all on account of the many feral cats that run rampant through our neighborhood. This nice dry hay that I've put down on the beds is effectively a calling card for every cat in a 5-mile radius that says, "Please poop here." I was hoping that moving away from the wood mulch I had going last year would make the beds a less inviting toilet, but no such luck. They've already started digging through places where I've put down even the wet lawn clippings, so this dry hay is just going to be a litter box for them. So as a countermeasure, I started laying down strips of wood, bundles of twigs, really anything I can think of to make the beds a less comfortable environment for the cats. I'm not sure if this will be enough. If it proves ineffective, as I'm out and about puttering in my yard, I can add more debris, and that's really what it is. Unfortunately, it makes everything look a little unsightly, and that's disappointing. But again, I would rather have an unsightly garden than a garden full of pathogenic cat poop. So here we are about 4 days after transplant, and everything's looking really healthy. Nothing's dying, which is an encouraging sign. This is one of the most anxiety-inducing times of the year for me post-transplant, and also just after seedlings emerge is another one. There's just so much that can go wrong. So what I wound up with at the end of this process is the following. I have 56 Rio Grande sauce tomatoes, 6 Virginia sweet slicing tomatoes, 6 Cherokee purple slicing tomatoes, 3 Patio Select dwarf variety cherry tomatoes, and 3 bush variety cherry tomatoes called Baxter's Bush Champion. Alright, I'm finally done with the bed prep and transplant process. All that's left to do now is wait and hope that nothing comes along and kills all of these. At this point, the tomatoes are in maintenance mode. Over the next few months, the job is to keep the plants healthy and well fed and watered so they survive to produce fruit. The year I filmed this video, I admittedly mistimed my seed starting. I had increased the overall intensity of my grow light setup, which led to my starts growing far faster than in previous years. The resulting overcrowding of the large plants in the small space of my grow light rack led to the edema issues mentioned earlier. As such, I took the gamble and planted them out in mid-March. Now, mid-March is typically well past the last frost date for Sacramento, but it's not quite past our damp and chilly season. Knowing that cool and damp conditions facilitate a number of destructive fungal ailments in tomatoes, I took some preventative measures. I obtained a bottle of copper fungicide concentrate and mixed with water according to the label in my 2-gallon sprayer. It's worth noting that it's far more economical to buy a bottle of concentrated product than it is to buy premix. Next, it was just a matter of applying the fungicide to each plant. This was admittedly a preventative measure. I had no indication my plants were developing a fungal ailment, but typically by the time a plant starts exhibiting symptoms, it's too late. I'm very neurotic about my tomato starts in the first month after transplant. While technically optional, pruning keeps plants from becoming overgrown, making it easier to spot diseases and harvest fruit. With indeterminate slicing tomatoes such as these, removing excess suckers, which are really just productive stems, typically makes for larger fruits, though they will be less numerous. Suckers can be identified by looking at the junction of the branches in the stem. The sucker looks like a mini tomato plant growing from that spot. In fact, if you propagate a removed sucker, it will grow into a whole new tomato plant. The pruning process for indeterminate tomatoes is actually fairly simple. I start by removing the lower branches. I like to clear about a foot of stem from the bottom of the plant, just get rid of all of the branches, maybe 12 inches up, and then I'll start working on removing some of the suckers. This year, I chose to trim everything down to a single productive stem just because I was more interested in having large slicing heirloom tomatoes than I was having numerous slicing heirloom tomatoes. But you can really leave as many productive stems as you feel like dealing with. The more you leave, the harder it is to harvest and maintain the plant. But you can let it go, into a full hedge and you'll still be all set. You'll still get plenty of fruit out of it. The next thing I do is secure the stem to my stake. There are other plant support options, but it is important to keep them tied off to something, or otherwise as the plant itself gets heavier and fruit start to develop, it will fall over, and that's never a great thing. I do recommend sterilizing scissors or clippers when moving from plant to plant. That's just a precaution in case one of the plants is infected with something. You don't want to be spreading diseases from one to another. So I carry a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a rag with me and just kind of wipe down my scissors or clippers in between plants. As the plant matured, in addition to removing suckers as I needed to, I would also look for any branches and leaves that looked like they were bug infested, or maybe in general they looked like they were shriveling up and dying and just not doing so well. I removed anything that wasn't looking good. You don't want to completely defoliate the plant. It does need to photosynthesize, but you can remove a lot. When it comes to determinate tomatoes, such as these Rio Grande paste and sauce tomatoes, the only pruning you're really going to want to do is removing leaves and branches near the bottom of the plant. This opens everything up and allows good airflow, which can really help mitigate a number of diseases. Whatever you do, you're not going to want to prune any suckers. A determinate tomato is really only going to produce so many fruits no matter what you do to it. So you want to maximize that and don't prune off any suckers unless, of course, a branch, a whole, stem is diseased with something. Then maybe you would want to get rid of it. Early in the season, my tomatoes were affected by the start of a whitefly infestation. I know from experience that a bad enough whitefly infestation can absolutely devastate a plant. Not only can the physical damage they inflict harm a plant, so can the diseases they are known to transmit. My solution was to apply an insecticidal soap to the undersides of leaves where the whitefly nymphs tend to live. It's a very mild product that doesn't provide a residual kill, making it less of a threat to pollinators as long as it's applied after the bees have called it quits for the day. Application in full sun should also be avoided, as leaf burn can occur. The insecticidal soap didn't kill every whitefly in my garden, of course, but it did keep their population down enough, so overall plant health wasn't affected. It's also worth pointing out that companion plants such as French marigold, nasturtium, and basil are said to repel whitefly. At present, my preferred fertilization method has been to prepare a soil drench from the general-purpose granular organic fertilizer mixes commonly found at garden supply and big box stores. I mix 1 cup of the granules into 5 gallons of chlorine-free water. I let it sit for about 24 hours, stirring occasionally. Then I'll give each plant a gallon or 2 of the solution every 3 or 4 weeks. In case you're wondering, it does stink, but not so bad your neighbors will call code enforcement on you. As long as I'm pretty sure my plants have enough nitrogen to keep them happy, I back off with nitrogen-heavy fertilizers when the plants start to blossom, and then switch to a phosphorus and potassium-forward fertilizer. These 2 nutrients promote healthy flowers and fruits. My approach to watering is infrequent but long watering sessions using the drip irrigation system. Infrequent watering encourages roots to grow deep, resulting in larger and healthier root systems overall. I typically end up running my drip system for about 45 minutes to an hour, once or twice a month, maybe a little more during heat waves, and I have yet to see any of my plants show any visible signs of underwatering. Eventually, the tomatoes will start to ripen and the harvest will begin to trickle in. Now, this is a somewhat controversial take among tomato growers, but I'm firmly in the camp of those who will pick their tomatoes before they're fully ripe, sometimes even at the first blush of color. Once the tomato has started to show color, often referred to as the break point, the fruit will ripen on or off the vine. Picking at the break point will make sure you get your tomatoes before the birds or rodents do, and during super hot summers like we get in Sacramento, tomatoes will actually ripen faster indoors. The ideal temperature window for tomato ripening is 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and we probably won't see those temperatures until November. As for flavor, some will insist vine-ripened tomatoes are superior to indoor-ripened, but to me, a ripe tomato is a ripe tomato. It especially doesn't seem to matter with paste and sauce tomatoes, which are usually cooked down with any number of herbs and spices prior to consumption anyway. I recommend using clippers to harvest whenever practical to do so, as yanking the fruits off the vine risks damaging both the fruit and the plant. Store the harvested fruits indoors in a dry location where temperatures will stay in the 70s to low 80s. Keeping tomatoes enclosed will trap the ethylene gas they emit while ripening, accelerating the process, but be sure to check on them frequently as a tomato will spoil quickly after reaching peak ripeness. It will soon be time to figure out how to preserve what can't be eaten fresh. Now, we all love fresh tomatoes, but the truth is we can only eat so many, and the thought of just letting the excess rot is unfathomable. When I have a glut of cherry tomatoes, which I almost always do during the summer, my preferred method of preservation is dehydration. I simply cut them into thin slices and arrange them on the dehydrator racks, and I find that setting them in the dehydrator for 12 to 16 hours at about 140 degrees usually gets them to the brittle point that I'm seeking. Here's what the tomatoes look like after dehydration. The dried tomatoes can then be loaded into some kind of grinding device. Here I'm using a coffee grinder, inefficient though it may be, and then ground into a fine powder. This powder is great for thickening soups, stews, and chilies, and makes a great base for a dry rub seasoning. Paste tomatoes and leftover slicing tomatoes often receive the traditional blanch, core, and peel method. First, a few cuts are made in the skin of the tomatoes at the bottom. Next, the tomatoes are placed in boiling water just until the skins begin to peel. This will usually take 30 seconds to 1 minute depending on the size and type of tomatoes. Small, thin-skinned tomatoes just need a quick dip, while large, thick-skinned tomatoes take a bit longer. The tomatoes are then removed to a cold water bath to stop them from cooking further. Finally, the skins and seeds are removed. I prefer to cut the tomato open to remove the seeds, but others prefer just to give the whole thing a good squeeze. I find that cutting and removing is less likely to cover your kitchen and you in tomato guts. This process is tremendously tedious and I enjoy absolutely none of it, but the end result is actually worth the effort. The peeled and cored tomatoes can be canned immediately, but I usually bag and freeze them until I have enough in storage to make a canning day worthwhile. Tomatoes can be frozen whole, unprocessed, and with the skins on, but they eat up a lot of freezer space that way. Also, masses of thawed tomatoes are a sloppy mess that kind of suck to deal with. As the season progressed, the tomatoes began ripening so fast I was harvesting 20 to 30 pounds every few days. Honestly, the thought of blanching, coring, and peeling 60 or more pounds of tomatoes a week sounds like some kind of ironic eternal punishment from Greek mythology, so I knew I needed a more efficient way of processing. I broke down and bought a tomato press. At a price of $130, the cost was relatively reasonable and assembly was pretty easy, but how well would it work? Turns out it works pretty well and actually makes tomato processing kind of fun. All I had to do was fill the hopper with raw, halved, and quartered tomatoes and mash them into the auger while turning the crank. This is far more efficient than peeling and coring. I was able to turn 1.5 gallons of raw tomatoes into a sauce for dinner in about 2 hours, and most of that time was spent cooking off moisture to thicken it. I'll still have to use the peel and core method on some tomatoes as I like having chunky salsa and diced tomatoes on hand, but overall the tomato press is a real game changer. I found I could run the scraps through a total of 3 times and keep extracting pulp. There was ultimately less waste than there is when I use the blanch, peel, and core method. I'm not going to get into the process of canning tomatoes here for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, while I have been canning homemade tomato products for a few years now and have not given anyone botulism, I don't consider myself enough of an expert on the subject to offer any kind of tutorial. Improperly home-canned foods can be a real health hazard. Secondly, canning is a whole complex topic of its own, and this video is already long enough. So that's my tomato cultivation method start to finish. I'll never suggest it's the ultimate method or that I won't continue to tweak and streamline procedures in the future as I learn more, but for now I'm pretty happy with the results. If anyone has any tomato growth tips and tricks they swear by, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and of course, until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.